welcome back to the lecture series on introductory environmental economics. Here today in this lecture we are talking about the environmental goods. Environmental goods part B. In part A we have talked about how to give valuation or how to derive the demand curve for environmental goods. We saw that for a public good and environmental good, for both, because they are missing markets, so one gets a difficult challenge in absence of markets to derive the demand curve for both of them. In the public goods, still we have the problem of we have the cost and an estimate of about the supply, and therefore one can think of deriving a demand curve. But however, in case of environmental goods, we saw that there is a difficult problem for assessing the supply side. From the demand side, we still made an attempt of deriving the willingness to pay concept. By using the willingness to pay concept, we derived the demand curve for environmental goods. Though the marginal willingness to pay was coming towards the lower end, that is the fourth quadrant, as the good is bad and there was a negative value associated with it. Another option of assessing about the environmental goods was taking the damage into account, the damage that is brought about by consuming the environmental good, and that lies in the positive quadrant. So there is a mirror image or mirror reflection of damage to the willingness to pay, and we saw that how the derivation was done. In this part of the lecture, we are now talking about the environmental good and broad classification of environmental good as use value and non-use value. Environmental goods can have a use value, and there have been various philosophical concepts behind that. Various economists have, ecologists have proposed various theoretical frameworks to understand the use and non-use value. So we have seen that according to McConnell, the notion of good is valued only for its existence and it provides no useful service is one way of finding out the existent value that occurs only as a bequest or altruistic notion that prevails. Resources are needed because they are valued by others, either for this generation or the future generation. So one can have a use value, but that usage may be linked with different sets of individuals. You may not be using it, but that good would be used in future by a different set of individuals. People can have what are essentially called as the existent value out of the unethical or altruistic concerns for the status of non-human species or for the proper rules of human conduct. All depends how a person is perceiving the usage. The philosophers of ethics do not agree with the validity and proper form of such concerns. It is possible that some people hold such values that are willing to commit resources based on those values. Such values could be extremely independent of any human use for the environment. So one can perceive a value for a natural resource or environmental good even if it is not being used by the humans. One can see the classification of environmental goods in two broad ways: use value as it is given on the screen, use value and non-use value. On one side, use value can be many use value, as it is written here, as it is shown in the diagram, in the schematic representation. Use value can be of three varieties: present use, expected use and possible use. However, non-use value can be of three separate varieties. It could be because of existence value, It could be non-use value, could be because of the altruistic value. And finally, a non-use value could also be a bequest value. As the name suggests, they are reflective of their individual names. Conventionally, we see that the use value of an environmental good includes the present use. The good which we are consuming right now, we are currently visiting, suppose we are visiting a wildlife sanctuary. So that is considered as a present use. However, expected use can also be, if we plan to visit that particular sanctuary later in this month or in future, that could become expected use. One is the present use, the other one is the expected use in future. The third type of use which we have talked about is a possible use. We might visit a sanctuary in the coming 5 years. The possible use is again a kind of probable use in future, where we are not sure when that use is going to happen, but it is possible that it may be useful in future times. That is why the environmental natural resources that we are endowed with can have a use value in various perspectives. We can be using them right now, we may be using them in future, which is expected, and we may be using it in the later half, and that could be a possible use. Use value of environmental good, therefore, opens up another notion of human impact, that is called as environmental good impact of humans, either directly or indirectly. One can have a use value of environmental good. uh, Either humans can be using the environmental good directly, or they may be getting affected or using the environmental good indirectly. Direct health effects of air pollution. So air pollution is one of the environmental good. One can be consuming directly the air pollution and get affected, leading to a health problems associated with it. In that case, the environmental good considered as environmental bad. Since it's a pollution, there is a negative connotation associated with it. Therefore, we would address it as environmental bad. It would result into mortality, various health, long-term health, chronic diseases, and even death. Morbidity, which is illness. So there are various negative effects associated in the consumption of this environmental good, which is pollution. It is an environmental bad. Therefore, we will call environmental pollution as environmental bad and not good. We may be consuming it and we may be suffering it directly through the health effects. So the use value of environmental good, therefore, there is another option of human impact which one should always see when we consider the use value and non-use value. Though it seems for the environmental bad, which is a pollution, though consuming pollution can be considered as a use value, but this use value of an environmental bad, which is pollution, is a direct health negative effect on pollution because of pollution. Apart from recreational use, ecosystems have further benefits, like they are the source of genetic material, or they are sometimes the input used in manufacturing the pharmaceuticals. So there may not be always for the ecosystem, the biodiversity which we see, it may not be used only for the recreation of parks or for wildlife sanctuaries or going to various entertainment, recreation. They may be used for other kind of purposes. For example, they may be used in scientific innovations for medical. science or creating medicines in pharmaceuticals. Measuring the value of ecosystem benefits or the services that it renders has emerged as a significant controversial area for valuation of environmental goods. This is because there are difficulties in determining the measurable or the tangible impacts which it renders by various services or by various uses related to the damage to the ecosystem. For example, one of the harmful impact and disruptions of the ecosystem due to environmental pollution is reduction of the number of species. So, the pollution, environmental pollution, which is an environmental bad, has indirectly affected the ecosystem, which is an ecological or the again a natural resource. And what it has affected is the number of species. So, how do we quantify the damage and how do we find out the valuation of this particular aspect? This would have a long term impact. The pollution today will not even be affecting the human health, but it is also affecting the ecosystem in the form of the species. So, this is considered as a long term impact in the future, not only on the mankind but on the whole of the ecosystem. This is the disruption of the ecosystem and its impact on mankind as a consequence is usually ignored. We have seen that it has been underemphasized by most of the environmental agencies. The impact is not only seen on the ecosystem by the loss of the life or the species, but an indirect impact on human use because the species could have been somewhere affecting the human life also. Now let us come to the next aspect of environmental good, which is a non-use value. Non-use value is the most debatable aspect of classification of environmental goods. Non-use value is defined as a gain to a person enhancing a person's utility without the person actually utilizing the good or its services directly. So, this type of good, which is a non-use value associated with the environmental good, a person directly does not consume that particular good. Indirectly, the person is utilizing the good without actively using it, but it is using its services indirectly. It rather refers to applying the word which is called as using very broadly. In this case of non-use value, one may value the ecosystem in a remote area without revealing or intending to visit that area and deriving any material benefit from the use of the ecosystem. Just because that area, wilderness area or that remote area is in the existence, one can have a use value which is called as a non-use value in this case. Similarly, one may also value a blue whale swimming freely in an open ocean despite having no intention of seeing the blue whale ever. They may not have seen a blue whale ever in person, but they may have a valuation for this particular concept of blue whale, and just the idea that it exists may give a non-use value. So, this is another aspect or another component of non-use value. Non-use value is further classified into three types: existence value, altruistic value and bequest value. As the name suggests, the existence value is the value a consumer perceives just by knowing the fact that something exists somewhere. For example, the value one places on the wildlife sanctuary in Africa. Sitting in India, one can have a valuation of wildlife sanctuary in Africa. This kind of a value is called as existence value, and it is a non-use value, as one is not actually actively using it, but just the existence of it is rendering a value to that natural resource. The pleasure one derives while knowing the wildlife's existence is that in that remote area. This is the addition to any value associated with potential or actual use. The second type of valuation that is obtained from non-use value is the altruistic value. Altruistic value is the value derived not from one's own consumption, but from the fact that others or someone else would be deriving the utility out of it. Keeping that yard clean in front of it is a benefit for your neighbors, and you obtain the utility from the fact that your neighbors are better off. Such an valuation is done basically a philosophical valuation, which is the benefit you derive by seeing the utility of others. The it is more of a concept of inner satisfaction or inner feeling that you derive, the happiness you derive by others' happiness or others' contentment. That kind of evaluation is considered as altruistic valuation. That is again a non-use valuation, since the person concerned is not directly using that particular environmental good or resource. Now the third type of non-use value is bequest value. Bequest value is almost the same type of a altruistic value only. It is deriving the happiness or the utility when others are better off. Bequest value accounts for the well-being of the future generation. However, there is a very slight difference between altruistic and bequest value. Altruistic tells you the present consumption, that the deriving the happiness from the utility of others is at the present moment is altruistic, while the fact that you will be deriving the happiness when your future generation will be consuming it, that is a bequest value. It is also the same concept as the altruistic value. If you value passing on the natural wildlife to the next generation, then the wildlife forest has a bequest value. Anything which you perceive that would lead to a satisfaction of future generation will be considered as bequest value to you, and it gives value to you, so that's why it's a non-use value. Even though you would not use that area in any way or the other at the present times, there is no direct materialistic use of that area at the present moment for you, but it may have or it may contain a bequest value for the future generation. Finally, the purpose of categorizing the environmental goods according to use and non-use value is to comprehend the difficulty and dichotomy of assessing the value of these environmental goods. Much of the environmental assets confer the value on consumers looking at the use value. So one has to have some valuation, maybe a use value or a non-use value valuation for the things like environmental goods or entities which are surrounding us. But coincidentally, many environmental assets have very less use value, instead they have significant non-use value. So we have seen the significance of both use value and non-use value when it comes to environmental valuation of various variety of environmental goods. Environmental goods, thus we have seen that they can have a use and non-use value. Use value are equally important than the non-use value, and the fact that the essence or the quantifying of non-use value is sometimes carries a more weightage as compared to use value, specifically in the case of environmental goods. Environmental goods, when we talk about environmental goods, we also talk about the environmental pollution. Environmental pollution, when it is the concern, it just kind of converts into environmental bad. And we have also seen that how environmental goods, without the presence of environmental bad, that is a pollution, in the absence of markets, can be assessed in the form of a marginal valuation of willingness to pay concept. Using that, we can identify or derive some sense of demand curve for these environmental bads. So in the entire range of valuation, the broad category remains the use and non-use value of environmental goods, and there are different ways of accounting both the use and non-use value. Both the use and non-use value have individually the three categories, and there are consensus by economists and ecologists on the variety of valuation methods, which we will discuss in the future lecture series, that how to give valuation to these total of 6 varieties: use valuation and non-use valuation, and what are the ways of creating markets, individual markets for assessing these environmental goods. As a matter of fact, we have seen that in this particular lecture, we have seen the definition of environmental good has been taken care of. It described the derivation of demand curve for environmental good using the method of willingness to pay, which is similar kind of a concept which can be adopted for the consumer surplus. As we have consumer surplus approach for the markets, we can have a willingness to pay approach for deriving the demand curve for environmental goods. Along with the willingness to pay approach, we have also seen that it is the damage side which is equally important for the environmental goods apart from the willingness to pay side. Willingness to pay side in environmental goods has to be reflected on the fourth quadrant, being it to be negative. The negative sign basically tells that all the people consuming that particular good, which is a pollution, which is a bad actually, they have to be compensated. Therefore, the willingness to pay falls in the negative quadrant. Mirror image of this willingness to pay is in the positive quadrant, that is the damage side. It is the amount of the damage that results from additional unit of consumption that is equated. Negative of that damage is what is perceived as willingness to pay. This willingness to pay concept has given us much better understanding of deriving the demand curve for environmental goods. The concept, the classification of environmental goods based on use and non-use valuation is a very important part of the entire environmental economics, and specifically when we are talking about environmental goods. This classification gives us the understanding how to value them and how to apply the method of willingness to pay concept while understanding the environmental goods. So this lecture overall, it gave us the entire brief of how one can perceive environmental goods when we are ourselves in a problem, and we have the case of the public goods, which is a difficult and a challenging case for deriving the supply side and the demand side. All the more the environmental good gives a challenge of the supply side, since we do not have any clue about the supply curve of environmental good. Though we have a good understanding of public good through the presence of the private market. For example, we have private market for the education, private schools. So an individual can have a supply assessment of these private goods. They can have um, basically quantify the various amount of levels of supply of these goods at various prices. So the price estimation or price uh, kind of assessment is possible in case of public goods. However, environmental goods are all the more challenging because the supply side is missing in case of environmental goods. In spite of that, we have this methodology which we have discussed today about the marginal willingness to pay, which has given us the tool to understand environmental goods in a much systematic manner and in a more mathematical framework, where we are plotting the willingness to pay vertically and we are plotting the environmental good horizontally. Thus, the one can compare the pollution and with the demand side of the pollution with the demand side of the gasoline, and it gives us the trade-off one can easily imagine or visualize of a normal good along with the environmental good. So that these kind of trade-offs are important for the existence and running of the economy, and therefore one has to look at the existence of both the types of goods, normal good which has a market, and public on one side. The other side is the public good and environmental goods which do not have, which have a challenge of valuation and which have a challenge of absence of market. So this was all about today's lecture of environmental goods. Hope you enjoyed the lecture. Thank you so much.